"You're not our real family," my daughter-in-law said after her wedding. 1 week later, she called me, desperate for rent. That's when I decided to end their game forever. The words oozed through the phone, sweet as poison. "It was just a small wedding, Margaret, only for our real family." Andrew's silence screamed louder than her cruelty. The phone sank in my hand like an anchor, dragging me toward the cold floorboards of my empty house. 3 years, $40,000. I thought I was building a family. I was only funding a performance. Love is not a transaction. That night, I opened my closet. The light flickered. There it was, the shimmering blue dress I bought for a wedding I was never invited to. Perfect. Useless. A monument to my foolishness. And the last one I would ever build for them. That blue dress was a monument, yes, but it wasn't the first one I'd built for them. It was just the first one I had truly seen. I closed the closet door. I walked to my study. I opened the laptop. The screen cast a cold blue light across my face in the darkness, the only light in the room. My hands moved with a strange certainty, my fingers tapping on the keyboard, pulling up years of my life converted into digital receipts. Online banking. It's so clean, isn't it? So sterile. There was the first wire transfer for their apartment deposit sent from my pension account. I remembered the note I'd typed into the memo field, a small, hopeful little flag in a sea of numbers. A little something to build your future. Love. Mom, I scrolled down. More transfers. Rent, always rent. Each one sent on the first of the month, a ritual of love I never missed, a duty I had assigned myself. For 3 years, every single month, a piece of my husband's legacy, the money he left to ensure my own peace, was siphoned away to fund a downtown loft I was rarely invited to. I wasn't building their future. I was paying for their present. I remembered the day they bought their sofa. I was there. They'd called me, excited, saying they'd found the perfect one but were just a little short. I drove downtown, my old checkbook tucked in my purse. The air in the store smelled of polished wood and expensive leather. Madison's eyes lit up when she saw me. She hugged me tight, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Oh, Margaret, you're a lifesaver. You have such timeless taste." I wrote the check. I watched them load it into the truck. I felt useful, needed. She ran her hand over the expensive fabric and smiled at me. "This will be perfect," she'd said, "just until we can afford our real designer pieces, of course." At the time, I heard gratitude. Tonight, I heard only condescension. Their appreciation always had an expiration date. The screen glowed. I kept scrolling. There was the vet bill from that purebred puppy Andrew just had to buy for her birthday, a puppy they couldn't afford, an emergency they knew I couldn't refuse. There was the small loan for the down payment on their second car, a loan that was never spoken of again. Each transaction was a story of their desires and my compliance. Each line item was a crack in the foundation I thought was built on love. It wasn't a foundation, it was a stage, and I was funding the performance. It all felt so obvious now, so painfully clear. I leaned back, the old leather of my husband's chair groaning under my weight. The sound echoed in the silence. It sounded lonely. And then I remembered. It was Christmas, 2 years ago. The house was full of laughter, the scent of pine and cinnamon thick in the air. Andrew stood up to make a toast, his face flushed with wine and happiness. He raised his glass to me. "To my mother," he announced to the room, a wide grin on his face. "The woman who makes it all possible. The First National Bank of Mom." The room erupted in laughter. Madison kissed his cheek. Our relatives chuckled and raised their glasses. "My own personal Swiss bank," he added, winking at me. I remember laughing. I remember feeling a swell of pride, of motherly affection. It was a joke, a silly, loving nickname from a son who appreciated his mother's generosity. That's what I told myself. Tonight, sitting alone in the cold glow of the monitor, there was no laughter. There was only the stark, ugly truth of a confession disguised as a joke. I reached for an old leather-bound journal on the desk. My husband had given it to me years ago. I opened it to the first blank page. With a steady hand, I wrote the date at the top, and underneath I gave his little joke a proper title. Andrew's Swiss Bank, Ledger. I had stopped laughing. I was just taking notes now. For the next 7 days, my little house in Portland was no longer a home. It was a library of grievances, a war room. My husband's old leather chair became my command post. The ledger he gave me became my weapon. I worked meticulously, scrolling through years of bank statements, my memory sharper than it had been in a decade. Every dollar was a soldier. Every receipt was a bullet. I documented the sofa, the puppy, the endless stream of $500 rent payments that flowed from my world into theirs. I ate, I slept, I chronicled. My grief had been replaced by a cold, clear purpose. I was no longer a victim of their story. I was the author of my own. And then, on the 8th day, the phone rang. The screen lit up with her name, Madison. I watched it vibrate on the dark wood of my desk, a frantic, angry buzzing in the quiet of my new world. For a moment, I considered letting it go, letting the silence be my answer. But I knew this was a call I had to take. This was the moment the game would truly begin. I let it ring one more time. Then I answered. I said nothing. Her voice tumbled out, a frantic mess of panic and entitlement. No hello, no preamble. Margaret, the landlord just called. He said the rent is overdue. I continued my silence. I could hear her sharp, shallow breaths on the other end. I pictured her pacing their expensive loft, her hand twisting in her perfectly highlighted hair. She waited for me to apologize, to explain, to fix it. When I offered nothing, her voice climbed higher. Did you forget to make the transfer? The automatic payment didn't go through. He's threatening to evict us. Margaret? This week. You forgot. The accusation hung in the air between us. The implication that after everything, this was my failure, my oversight, my responsibility. All those years of perfect on-time payments, and the first time it stops, I am the one at fault. Their emergency was a failure of my obedience. As she continued her frantic monologue, my eyes scanned the page I was working on in the ledger. Entry number 47, Aspen ski trip, airfare. Source, my savings account. She had told me it was an advance on Andrew's bonus. A lie. And then she made her mistake. We can't be evicted now, she cried, her voice cracking with theatrical desperation. It would be a disaster. We just paid the final deposit for the New Year's trip to Aspen. We can't lose that money. There it was, the final piece of the puzzle, offered up so freely in her panic. They weren't struggling. They were planning vacations with money they didn't have, on the blind assumption that my own funds were infinite and eternally available. They weren't drowning. They were just careless. Careless with my money. Careless with my love. Her voice softened then, shifting gears into the familiar, wheedling tone of emotional blackmail, the one she saved for special occasions. Margaret, please. Think of Andrew. He's your son. You can't let this happen to him, to us, and that's when it happened. A strange quiet fell over me. The burning in my chest, the ache behind my eyes that had been my constant companion for a week. It all just stopped. It felt like the blood in my veins had turned to ice. In that cold, clear silence, an idea began to form. Not an idea born of sadness or anger, but of strategy. My son. The words echoed in the new, cold silence within me. For a week I had been a ship lost in a fog of grief. Now the fog had lifted, and I could finally see the shore. I took a slow, deliberate breath. When I spoke, the voice that came out was not my own. It was calmer, colder. It was the voice of a woman who had nothing left to lose. That's an interesting word, Madison. Family is another one. A confused silence on her end. I didn't give her time to process it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet was my weapon now. I am so sorry about your rent situation, I said, each word perfectly spaced, perfectly clear. But my financial help is reserved for my real family now. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't confused. It was the stunned, airless silence of a trap snapping shut. I could hear a sharp intake of breath, followed by a stream of sputtering disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, unfiltered rage. Her game had been interrupted. The rules had been changed without her permission. I listened. I learned. I hung up. I pressed the red icon on my screen, cutting off her tirade mid-sentence. The silence that rushed back into the room was beautiful. It was the sound of freedom. For the first time in years, my home was truly my own. No longer an extension of their bank account, no longer a resource to be tapped. It was a sanctuary, my headquarters. They wrote the rules. I was just going to enforce them. My eyes scanned the study. They settled on a dusty corner of the highest bookshelf, a place I hadn't looked in years. I stood up, pulled the small stepladder from the corner, and climbed. My hands, steady now, reached for an old, forgotten volume. It was a leather-bound ledger, thick and heavy. My late husband, Robert, had given it to me on our 10th anniversary. He was an accountant, a man of numbers and integrity. He always said, "Numbers don't lie, Margaret." People do. He'd meant it as a joke, a gift for me to track my library book loans, a silly, romantic gesture. I never used it until tonight. I carried it back to the desk, wiping a decade of dust from the cover with the sleeve of my sweater. The leather was still supple, the air filled with the scent of aged paper and old memories, a scent of a time when love was simple and unquestioned. I sat down, the weight of the book solid and reassuring in front of me. This was no longer just a gift. It was a legacy, an inheritance of integrity. I opened to the first crisp, cream-colored page. I picked up my favorite fountain pen, the one Robert had used to sign our mortgage. The ink was dark, permanent. With a hand that did not shake, I wrote the title across the top of the page, giving Andrew's little joke from Christmas the dignity it deserved. Andrew's Swiss bank, ledger. I paused, admiring my work. It looked official. Then I began the first entry. It wasn't a number. It wasn't a dollar amount. The first debt was far greater than that. Entry number 1, item, invitation to son's wedding. Cost to me, basic human decency, acknowledgement as family, status, payment defaulted. I kept writing. The only sound in the entire house was the scratch, scratch, scratch of my pen on the page. The tears had finally stopped. A librarian knows one thing better than anyone. Everything, eventually, gets recorded. The ledger was the map of my war. But a map is useless without territory. My home was the first territory I would reclaim. The locksmith arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. He was a quiet man with efficient hands. I didn't watch him work, but I listened. I sat in my study, the ledger open before me, and I listened to the sounds of my liberation, the high-pitched whir of his drill, the sharp scrape of old metal being removed, and then the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. A solid, definitive click as the new deadbolt slid into place. A sound that said, no, not anymore. That afternoon I called a lawyer, not just any lawyer from a billboard. I spent 4 hours in my old librarian mindset, cross-referencing databases, reading reviews, and vetting case histories. I was looking for a very specific kind of warrior. I found him in downtown Portland, a man named Mr. Albright who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation. His website had a simple, powerful slogan: protecting legacies, restoring dignity. I researched. I called. I hired him. My final step was the cameras. A discreet system, small black domes tucked under the eaves of the roof. They watched the front door, the driveway, the back gate. The irony was suffocating. I had spent my life building a home so full of trust that we never locked the doors. Now, I was turning it into a fortress, not to keep strangers out, but to keep my own family at bay. A library is a place of order. My life would be one, too. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a sleek black sedan pulled into my driveway. I was in my study, watching the live feed on my monitor. Andrew got out of the driver's side. Madison emerged from the passenger seat. But they weren't alone. A man in an expensive-looking gray suit got out of the back. He carried a leather briefcase. I didn't recognize him, but I knew what he was. Trouble. I watched on the screen as Madison walked confidently up to my front door. She didn't knock. She plunged her key into the lock. I saw the flicker of confusion on her face as it failed to turn. She tried again, jiggled it. Nothing. Then came the pounding, hard, angry thumps against the solid oak. "Margaret, open this door. We know you're in there." Andrew looked uncomfortable. He put a hand on her arm, but she shook it off. The man in the suit stood back on the lawn, observing, his face a mask of professional neutrality. I turned up the volume on my monitor. "Mom, please," Andrew's voice thin and strained through the door. "We just want to talk." This is ridiculous. I said nothing. I just watched. My finger hovered over the record button. Madison's voice became shrill, piercing. "You can't just cut us off. We have rights. Andrew is your son. What is wrong with you?" Her performance was escalating. Theatrics for the man in the suit, I presumed. She was building her case, painting me as an unstable, irrational old woman. It was a good strategy. It just wasn't good enough. She took a step back from the door, her face a grotesque mask of fury on my screen. Her hands were clenched into fists. She looked from the door to Andrew, then back again, as if realizing for the first time that her key, her access, her power was truly gone. And then she screamed it. The words I knew were coming. The words her expensive lawyer was probably waiting to hear. "You're insane. You've completely lost your mind." My eyes never left the monitor. I watched the digital timestamp in the corner of the screen. I watched the audio levels peak in the red. I made sure the recording was saved to the cloud. Secure, permanent. A small, cold smile touched my lips for the first time in weeks. Perfect. A courtroom is, in its own way, a library, a collection of stories. The only difference is that in the end, a judge decides which story is true. Madison and Andrew had spent a month preparing their work of fiction. I had spent a lifetime preparing my nonfiction. The man in the gray suit, their lawyer, Mr. Davies, stood before the judge. He was smooth, polished, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, insincere sympathy. He painted a picture of a beloved mother, a cherished matriarch, suddenly lost in a fog of paranoia and confusion. He spoke of my erratic behavior, my sudden hostility, my alarming isolation. He used words like cognitive decline and vulnerable, and then he delivered the line they had paid him to say. "Your Honor, we are here today not out of greed, but out of fear. Fear for a woman who has become a danger to herself. We are here to protect Margaret Collins from her own mentally incompetent decisions." I felt the eyes of the court on me. Andrew's, Madison's, the judge's. I did not flinch. I did not move. I simply looked straight ahead, my hands resting calmly on the table before me. I had read this chapter before. I already knew how it ended. Madison was their star witness. She took the stand dressed in a conservative black dress, a single strand of pearls at her throat. She looked like a grieving daughter. Her performance was breathtaking. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief as she described my sudden change. She spoke of my love of books turning into a reclusive obsession. She described the security cameras as proof of a paranoid fantasy. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the phone call. "She was so cold," Madison whispered, her voice cracking. "It was like talking to a stranger." "We were so worried. We just wanted to help her. She was good, I had to admit. Every tear was perfectly timed. Every tremor in her voice was a masterclass in manipulation. The truth is quiet, but its receipts are loud. Then it was my lawyer's turn. Mr. Albright stood up. He was the opposite of their lawyer. He wasn't smooth. He was solid, like an old oak tree. He approached the witness stand slowly. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice calm and steady. "You testified that you were worried about your mother-in-law's mental state after that phone call. Is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely," Madison said, dabbing her eyes again. "And what was that call about?" "It was about the rent. The rent that your mother-in-law had been paying for you for 3 consecutive years?" Madison shifted in her seat. "She was helping us out, yes." "I see," Mr. Albright said, making a note. "And in the weeks leading up to this call, while you were so deeply concerned about her financial stability, were you, by any chance, planning any expensive vacations?" The color drained from Madison's face. I don't see how that's relevant." "A trip to Aspen, perhaps? For New Year's?" Silence. The judge leaned forward slightly. Madison looked desperately toward her lawyer, but he could do nothing. She was trapped. "It was a gift," she stammered. "A gift," Mr. Albright repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "From whom?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. When it was my turn, I told my story. Simply. Factually. Without tears or theatrics. I spoke of my love for my son. I spoke of my hope for their future. And I spoke of the secret wedding. Then Mr. Albright approached the bench. "Your Honor, I would like to present Exhibit A." He placed the old leather-bound ledger on my table. My hands did not shake as I took it. "Mrs. Collins," he asked, "can you please read the title you have written on the first page of this journal?" I cleared my throat. I looked at my son, Andrew. His face was pale. I read the title into the microphone, my voice echoing slightly in the silent room. Andrew's Swiss Bank Ledger. I saw Andrew flinch, as if struck. The memory of his own joke, his own words, now laid bare as the title of his indictment. Mr. Albright had me read a few key entries: the wedding, the car, the Aspen trip, each one a cold, hard fact. But they weren't done. "Your Honor," Mr. Albright said, "the plaintiffs have testified that my client has been acting insane. We would now like to present Exhibit B security footage from my client's front porch, dated 2 weeks ago." The large screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The image was clear. My front door. And Madison, her face twisted in rage, her fists clenched. And then her voice, shrill and ugly, filled the room. "You're insane! You've completely lost your mind!" The video ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Madison stared at the blank screen, her mouth slightly open, her mask of grief and concern utterly shattered. She was no longer the worried daughter-in-law. She was just a woman on a screen screaming. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at Madison. I looked at my son. And for the first time, Andrew turned and looked at his wife. Really looked at her. And the expression on his face was one I had never seen before. It wasn't love. It wasn't loyalty. It was the slow, dawning horror of a man realizing the monster he had married. In the end, there was no dramatic outburst, no shouted verdict. There was only a heavy, profound silence. The judge, a woman with kind but tired eyes, looked down at the documents, then at the frozen image of Madison on the screen. She cleared her throat. The sound echoed in the quiet room. The petition for conservatorship was dismissed, with prejudice, which meant they could never file it again. The judge spoke for a few minutes about the misuse of the court's time, about the sanctity of family. I didn't listen to the words. I didn't need to. I just watched my son. He never looked at me again. His eyes were fixed on his wife, the horror slowly being replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. He had built his life around her performance, and the curtains had just been torn down in the most public way imaginable. The show was over. As we filed out, Andrew started to move toward me, a single hesitant step. I met his gaze from across the room. I didn't shake my head. I didn't offer a forgiving smile. I just looked at him. And in my eyes, I think he finally saw the ruin he had allowed to happen. He stopped. He turned away. And that was that. I heard later, through a distant cousin, that they sold the loft. That Madison had to get a job for the first time in a decade, working in retail. I heard they were struggling. I took no pleasure in it. I felt nothing at all. Their story was no longer my story. I had closed the book. Selling my house in Portland was easier than I thought. For 40 years, it had been my sanctuary. But in the end, it was just a library of memories, and some of the books were poisoned. I hired movers. I packed boxes. I worked with the quiet efficiency of a librarian deaccessioning a collection. I sorted. I packed. I let go. I found an old photo tucked away in a drawer. Andrew, age 7, grinning with a missing front tooth, holding up a crooked clay pot he'd made for me. My heart gave a familiar pang, a ghost of an ache. But it wasn't grief. It was an echo. A memory of a love that was real. Once. I looked at the smiling boy for a long moment. Then I placed the photo gently into a box labeled Donate. Some goodbyes are not endings. They are an opening. The day I left, I stood in the empty living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the clean windows. The movers were gone. All that was left were faint squares on the walls where pictures used to hang. I ran my hand along the doorframe. I said my silent goodbyes. Then I walked out and closed the door for the last time, not looking back. The key to my new apartment felt light in my palm, unfamiliar, full of promise. It was a small place on the Oregon coast with a balcony that overlooked the Pacific. The first thing that hit me was the air. It was clean, crisp, and tasted of salt and freedom. There were no ghosts here, no memories lurking in the corners, just bright, empty rooms waiting for a new story. My story. For the first week, I did nothing. I just sat on my balcony, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and I watched the ocean. I watched the waves roll in, crash on the shore, and retreat, over and over, a constant peaceful rhythm, the rhythm of release. I wasn't waiting for a phone call. I wasn't bracing for another crisis. I was just being. For so long, I had defined myself by my role: wife, mother, provider. Now I was just Margaret, and I was learning to be enough. This evening, the sun is setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. A gentle breeze drifts across my balcony. My tea is warm. Next to me on the small table is the old leather ledger, my weapon, my shield, my Declaration of Independence. The table is a little wobbly. It has been since I bought it. I look at the ledger, then I look at the small pot of vibrant red geraniums sitting on the railing, a splash of defiant life against the vast blue of the sea. Slowly, deliberately, I pick up the heavy ledger. I slide it under one leg of the small table. The wobbling stops. I take the pot of geraniums and place it carefully on the table, right on top of the ledger's cover. The book that once chronicled so much pain and betrayal is now doing something else. It's providing balance. It's supporting something beautiful and alive and growing. I take a sip of my tea. I watch the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. I finally understand. True value is not what you give, but who you are. Thank you so much for being here and listening to this journey. If this story resonated with you, I would be honored to read your own thoughts or experiences in the comments below. And of course, if you'd like to hear more, please subscribe to join our community.